The silence in the ballroom did not break. It deepened. Lieutenant Kyle Morgan felt it settle over his shoulders like weight. 6 Marines stood at attention behind him, their faces composed, their posture flawless, their eyes fixed forward. Master Sergeant Ryan Cole did not lower his gaze from Thomas Whitaker. The lines around Cole's eyes tightened, not with anger, but with recognition. "Permission granted," Tom said softly, almost reluctantly, as if the words cost him more than the young lieutenant could understand. Cole stepped forward one measured pace, heels clicking against marble with quiet precision. The 5 Marines behind him mirrored the movement exactly, a ripple of disciplined motion that required no command. The room watched in absolute stillness. The cake, the banners, the orchestra in the corner, all seemed distant now, like decorations in a photograph. Morgan turned fully toward Cole, confusion sharpening his tone. "Master Sergeant, what is the meaning of this?" Cole did not look at him immediately. His eyes drifted instead to the small bronze coin still resting in Tom's palm. He swallowed once before speaking. "Sir, may I see that coin?" Tom hesitated only a second before extending his hand. The coin caught the chandelier light, revealing the worn insignia of Echo Company, 3rd Battalion, a unit deactivated more than 40 years ago. On the reverse side, 6 small hash marks were etched in uneven lines. Cole took a slow breath. "I have seen this before," he said, his voice steady but low. Around the ballroom, older Marines began to shift in their seats. A few recognized the emblem. A few recognized the name that had been whispered in unit history classes and memorial ceremonies. Lance Corporal Aidan Brooks felt his pulse in his ears. He remembered the photograph in the hallway. 6 young Marines standing shoulder to shoulder. Beneath it, a small brass plaque that read, "Rescued under fire. Returned home together." No citation listed. No medal displayed. Just a name at the bottom. Thomas Whitaker. Lieutenant Morgan's jaw tightened. "Master Sergeant, if this gentleman is not on the guest list, I cannot make exceptions." Cole finally turned his head. His expression was respectful, but there was iron beneath it. "Sir, with respect, you are not making an exception." He handed the coin back carefully, as if returning something sacred. "You are correcting a mistake." The words did not rise in volume, yet they carried across the ballroom. Conversations did not resume. No one reached for a glass. Morgan felt the eyes of 200 Marines on his back. "Explain," he said, though the certainty had drained from his voice. Cole squared his shoulders. 48 years ago, 6 Marines from Echo Company were cut off during an operation outside Unlock. Communications were lost. Extraction was delayed. They were declared missing for 6 hours. He paused, choosing each word deliberately. One civilian contractor attached to the advisory group volunteered to go back for them. Tom's gaze dropped to the floor, not in shame, but in quiet memory. The ballroom seemed to fade for a heartbeat, replaced by humid air and the distant thrum of rotor blades waiting for clearance. Cole continued. He did not leave until all 6 were accounted for. That coin was given to him that night. 6 marks. One for each Marine who made it home. A murmur moved through the hall, not loud, but alive. Morgan felt the flush creep up his neck. "Are you saying," he began carefully, "that this man was attached to your unit?" Cole met his eyes directly now. "No, sir. I am saying this man carried my unit when it could not carry itself." The weight of it settled fully then. Around the ballroom, more chairs began to move. Not in protest. In solidarity. Boots aligned. Spines straightened. A room full of Marines rose slowly to their feet, one by one, until the only man still standing uncertainly in the center of the marble floor was the lieutenant who had asked the legend to leave. The sound of boots settling against marble rolled through the ballroom like distant thunder that never quite broke into noise. Lieutenant Kyle Morgan stood motionless, the weight of 200 Marines rising behind him pressing against his back more forcefully than any spoken word. No one had given an order. No command had been issued. They simply stood. Thomas Whitaker remained near the wall beneath the American flag, the fabric shifting slightly in the current of conditioned air, its colors reflected faintly across his worn suit jacket. He looked almost uncomfortable with the attention, his shoulders drawing in as if he would rather disappear into the shadow than stand at the center of it. Master Sergeant Ryan Cole took one more step forward, then turned to face the room. His voice carried without effort. Marines, he said evenly. This is Mr. Thomas Whitaker. He did not raise his tone. He did not dramatize the moment. He simply spoke the name with the weight it deserved. Across the hall, older non-commissioned officers exchanged glances of recognition. A few nodded subtly. Lance Corporal Aidan Brooks felt the story he had once read on a brass plaque come fully alive in front of him. He saw not just an elderly man in a gray suit, but the quiet gap in a unit's history that had never been filled with ceremony. Lieutenant Morgan finally stepped back half a pace. The polished floor felt less stable beneath him now. Mr. Whitaker, he said carefully, the edge gone from his voice, I was not aware. Tom offered a small nod. You were doing your job, Lieutenant, he replied. His tone held no accusation, no bitterness, just fact. The orchestra in the corner lowered their instruments entirely, sensing that the evening had shifted into something unscripted. Cole lifted his hand slowly and came to attention. The motion was deliberate, respectful. 5 Marines beside him mirrored it instantly. Then, without instruction, the rest of the ballroom followed. 200 Marines stood at rigid attention beneath the chandeliers, the soft glow of amber light glinting off brass buttons and polished metals. The room had transformed from celebration to ceremony in less than 10 seconds. Cole's right hand rose sharply to his brow in a perfect salute. The gesture was not hurried. It was not theatrical. It was precise and absolute. One by one, every Marine in the ballroom raised their hand in unison until a forest of white-gloved salutes filled the air. The sound of fabric shifting and heels locking into place created a quiet rhythm that carried deeper than applause ever could. Tom Whitaker inhaled slowly. His eyes shimmered, but his posture remained steady. For a long moment he did not move, as if absorbing something long overdue. Then, with careful dignity, he returned the salute. Not sharply, not as a command, but as acknowledgement. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of understanding, full of respect that required no explanation. Lieutenant Morgan lowered his gaze briefly before straightening himself. Sir, he said, his voice steady now. On behalf of this unit, welcome home. The words settled into the room like a promise kept. At last, no one clapped. No one cheered. They simply held their posture, the American flag overhead standing still and proud above a room that had remembered what honor truly looked like. The salutes lowered slowly, not because anyone ordered it, but because the moment had settled into something steady and enduring. The orchestra remained silent, bows resting against strings, as if unwilling to disturb what had just taken place. Master Sergeant Ryan Cole stepped closer to Thomas Whitaker, his posture easing just slightly from rigid attention into something more personal. Sir, Cole said quietly, though the entire ballroom could still hear him, we have an empty seat at our table. Tom glanced toward the round table at the center of the hall, where 6 Marines stood waiting. Their chairs were pushed back evenly, glasses untouched, cake plates undisturbed. They were not young men fresh from training. They were seasoned Marines, some with gray at their temples, some with scars hidden beneath dress sleeves, all carrying themselves with the calm confidence of experience. Tom hesitated, looking once more at the bronze coin in his hand before closing his fingers around it. I do not want to interrupt your celebration, he said. Cole allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile. Sir, you are the reason we get to have one. Around the room, a soft murmur of agreement moved like a current. Lieutenant Kyle Morgan stepped forward again, but his tone had transformed entirely. Mr. Whitaker, if you would permit it, I would be honored to escort you. The words were no longer procedural. They were sincere. Tom studied the young officer for a long second, seeing not arrogance now, but humility forming in its place. Very well, Lieutenant, he replied. Morgan extended his arm in quiet support, not because Tom appeared frail, but because the gesture itself carried meaning. Together they walked across the marble floor, boots and polished shoes echoing softly beneath the chandeliers. Every Marine remained standing as Tom passed. Eyes followed him, not with curiosity, but with recognition. At the table, Cole pulled back the center chair. As Tom sat, the 6 Marines remained upright for another respectful heartbeat before taking their seats with controlled precision. The rest of the ballroom followed, chairs settling in unison like a single exhale. The orchestra resumed gently, a low instrumental version of the Marines' hymn drifting through the hall. Without fanfare, Cole leaned slightly toward Tom. "We kept the coin design," he said quietly. "It is still issued to our platoon leaders." Tom looked down at the small bronze disc in his palm and nodded once. "It was never about the coin," he said. "It was about bringing everyone home." Lance Corporal Aidan Brooks listened from 2 tables away, committing every word to memory. Lieutenant Morgan remained standing beside the table a moment longer before speaking once more. "Sir," he said to Tom, "would you do us the honor of cutting the first slice of cake tonight?" The request hung in the air, simple yet profound. Tom's eyes lifted toward the large ceremonial cake beneath the eagle, globe, and anchor. For a moment, the years seemed to soften around him. He gave a small nod. "It would be my privilege." As he rose again, the room did not erupt into applause. It did something quieter and far more powerful. It stood with him. Because sometimes respect does not arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives when those who understand choose to rise together. The ceremonial sword felt heavier than Thomas Whitaker expected, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. Lieutenant Kyle Morgan held it out with both hands, the polished blade catching the chandelier light as if it carried its own quiet flame. Tom accepted it carefully, his fingers steady despite the years etched into his skin. The ballroom rose once more as he stepped toward the towering cake crowned with the eagle, globe, and anchor. The orchestra shifted into a fuller, richer arrangement of the Marines' hymn, the notes swelling just enough to fill the space without overpowering it. Master Sergeant Ryan Cole stood to Tom's right, close but not intrusive, his posture reflecting pride more than ceremony. "Sir," Cole said softly, "it would mean a great deal to us." Tom looked across the sea of dress blues before him. Rows of Marines stood straight and silent, faces illuminated by warm amber light, eyes fixed on him not as a guest, but as part of their lineage. For a fleeting moment, the ballroom faded in his mind and was replaced by humid air and the distant hum of rotor blades waiting on a dark landing zone decades earlier. He remembered young faces, anxious but determined, boots sinking into wet ground, hands gripping one another's sleeves. As they moved forward together, he remembered promises made without paperwork, loyalty built without recognition. The memory did not carry noise. It carried weight. Tom drew a slow breath and placed the flat of the sword gently against the cake. "Happy birthday, Marines," he said, his voice calm but resonant. The blade descended in a clean, deliberate line, cutting the first slice with the precision of a man who understood that some traditions mattered more than applause. As the slice separated, a ripple moved through the room. Not cheers, not whistles, just the unmistakable hum of pride held carefully in check. Lieutenant Morgan felt it in his chest. He had studied leadership at academies and field exercises, had memorized codes and procedures, but this moment taught him something no manual ever could. Respect was not enforced. It was earned, protected, and sometimes rediscovered. When Tom handed the sword back, Morgan received it with both hands and a slight bow of his head. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly. Tom nodded once. "Take care of each other," he replied. "That is the only part that ever really mattered." Lance Corporal Aidan Brooks stood at attention, committing every second to memory. He understood now why the plaque in the hallway had been simple. No citation, no long explanation, just a name and a promise kept. Master Sergeant Cole lifted his glass once the cake was plated and distributed. "To those who carried us," he said, voice steady. Around the ballroom, glasses rose in unison. "And to those who still do." The words settled into the rafters, into the flags, into the polished floor beneath their feet. Thomas Whitaker sat back down among them, no longer an outsider near the wall, but woven back into the fabric of the core. The music swelled again, conversations resumed, laughter returned, yet something fundamental had shifted. A lesson had been remembered without a lecture. A debt had been acknowledged without ceremony. And beneath the steady gaze of the American flag, a room full of Marines understood that sometimes the strongest command is not shouted. It is simply honored. The ballroom gradually returned to its rhythm, but the air felt different now, steadier, as if something long unsettled had finally found its place. Thomas Whitaker remained seated at the center table with Master Sergeant Ryan Cole and the 5 Marines who had first risen for him. Cake had been served, glasses refilled, conversations carefully resumed, Yet every few moments another Marine approached the table. They did not interrupt loudly. They waited their turn. Each one offered a handshake. Some offered a quiet thank you. None of them asked for details. They did not need them. Lieutenant Kyle Morgan stood a short distance away, observing. The sharp edge that had defined his posture earlier in the evening had softened into something reflective. After several minutes he stepped forward, stopping just beside Tom's chair. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, his voice measured. "May I sit with you for a moment?" Tom looked up, studying the young officer with patient eyes. "Of course, Lieutenant." Morgan took the empty chair to Tom's left, removing his white gloves and placing them carefully on the table. For a brief second, he searched for the right words. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "I saw a man without a uniform and assumed he did not belong." Tom regarded him quietly. "That is an easy mistake to make," he replied. "Uniforms make things clear. Life does not always do that." Morgan nodded, absorbing the lesson without defensiveness. Around them, the orchestra shifted into a softer arrangement, the melody flowing gently through the room like memory itself. "How did you do it?" Morgan asked after a pause. "Going back for them." The question was not driven by curiosity about danger or drama. It was rooted in something deeper. Tom rested his hands lightly on the table. "They were not numbers," he said. "They were young men who trusted one another. When someone trusts you, you answer." His tone carried no pride, only certainty. Lance Corporal Aidan Brooks leaned slightly closer from across the table, listening carefully. "Sir," Brooks said respectfully, "they still teach about Echo Company. They just never mention your name." Tom gave a faint smile. "That is all right. The point was never to be mentioned." Cole placed a firm hand on the table. "With respect, sir, the point was that you showed us what leadership looks like." Tom glanced at the bronze coin once more before slipping it into his jacket pocket. "Leadership," he said thoughtfully, "is not about being seen. It is about standing up when someone else cannot." Morgan let the words settle. He understood now why 6 Marines had risen without command. It had not been rebellion. It had been recognition. Across the ballroom, the commanding officer approached the microphone for the evening's formal remarks. The room gradually quieted. As he began to speak about honor, tradition, and the long line of Marines who had shaped the Corps, his gaze found Tom at the center table. "Tonight," the commanding officer said, voice carrying clearly across the hall, "we are reminded that the strength of this Corps does not fade with time. It lives in those who carried it forward before us." No names were called. No spotlight shifted. Yet every Marine in the room knew exactly who he meant. Tom sat calmly, neither seeking nor avoiding the attention. He simply listened. And as the words echoed beneath the high ceiling, Lieutenant Morgan felt something permanent settle inside him. Authority could command obedience, but respect had to be recognized. And once recognized, it rose on its own. The formal remarks concluded with steady applause, disciplined and respectful, and the commanding officer stepped away from the microphone. The orchestra resumed with a confident tempo, and the ballroom began to breathe again. Conversations restarted in measured tones, glasses clinked softly, and the warmth of the evening returned without losing its sense of gravity. Thomas Whitaker remained seated for a moment longer, watching the younger Marines move through the room with renewed awareness in their posture. He could see it in the way they carried themselves now, not just pride in uniform, but connection to something older than themselves. Master Sergeant Ryan Cole leaned slightly closer. "Sir, would you walk with me?" he asked. Tom nodded and rose carefully from his chair. Around them, Marines instinctively shifted to create a clear path without being asked. Boots pivoted, shoulders squared. It was subtle, but deliberate. Lieutenant Kyle Morgan followed a respectful distance behind, not out of obligation, but because he did not want to miss what came next. Cole guided Tom toward a framed photograph mounted along the far wall of the ballroom. It was not part of the formal decorations. It was part of the unit's history display, temporarily set up for the celebration. The photograph was black and white, edges slightly faded. 6 young Marines stood in a line, uniforms worn but eyes bright, their expressions steady despite the years captured in grain. Beneath the frame, a brass plate reflected the chandelier light. Echo Company, 3rd Battalion. Together returned. Tom stopped a few feet away, hands resting at his sides. He did not reach for the frame. He did not need to. He recognized every face immediately. "We added it back to the display 5 years ago," Cole said quietly. It had been stored in the archive. Tom's eyes lingered on the image. They look young, he murmured. We were, Cole replied with a faint smile. Lance Corporal Aiden Brooks approached cautiously, standing just behind Morgan. Sir, Brooks said to Tom, may I ask something? Tom turned slightly. Go ahead. Brooks hesitated only briefly. Why did you never come back before tonight? The question held no accusation, only curiosity. Tom considered it. Because it was never about being remembered, he answered. It was about knowing they made it home. He glanced again at the 6 faces in the frame. Once I knew that, my part was done. Morgan felt those words settle into him more deeply than any leadership lecture he had attended. Cole reached up and lightly touched the edge of the frame. Sir, with respect, your part is still teaching. The music swelled gently behind them, laughter carrying across the ballroom once more. Marines moved past, offering quiet nods as they recognized the photograph and the man standing before it. Tom straightened his jacket slightly and gave one last look at the image before turning back toward the room. The celebration continued, but something permanent had shifted in its foundation. Not because a legend had been announced, but because humility had been witnessed. As Tom walked back toward the center of the hall, Lieutenant Morgan fell into step beside him, not as an escort this time, but as a student walking beside a lesson he would not forget. And beneath the steady gaze of history framed on the wall, the Corps remembered that honor does not demand recognition. It simply stands when it matters. The evening continued with renewed warmth, but the tone had shifted from ceremony to connection. Thomas Whitaker stood near the history display for a few minutes longer, speaking quietly with a small group of younger Marines who approached with measured respect. They did not crowd him. They did not overwhelm him with questions. They simply listened. The chandelier light reflected softly off the polished brass frame of the photograph behind him, casting a faint glow around the 6 young faces preserved in time. Lieutenant Kyle Morgan remained nearby, hands clasped behind his back, absorbing every word Tom chose to share. Sir, one young sergeant asked carefully, what kept you steady back then? Tom considered the question without haste. The man to your left, he replied, and the one to your right. The sergeant nodded slowly, understanding more from the simplicity of the answer than any detailed explanation could provide. Master Sergeant Ryan Cole glanced at Morgan briefly, recognizing the lesson landing in real time. Across the ballroom, the cake had been fully served, and Marines moved between tables exchanging stories from deployments and training exercises. Yet the story unfolding near the photograph felt different. It was quieter, deeper. Tom reached into his jacket and removed the bronze challenge coin once more. He held it out to the young sergeant. Feel the edges, he said. The Marine took it gently, noticing how smooth the metal had become after decades of handling. Time wears things down, Tom continued, but it also shapes them. Morgan stepped closer, studying the coin more carefully than he had earlier. Sir, he said thoughtfully, why did you keep this instead of accepting recognition? Tom smiled faintly. Recognition fades, he answered. Responsibility does not. The words lingered in the air longer than the music drifting from the orchestra. Lance Corporal Aiden Brooks approached with a respectful nod. Sir, we have a small tradition at the end of the ball, Brooks said. We dim the lights for a moment of reflection. Cole looked at Tom. Would you join us? Tom gave a quiet nod. The ballroom lights gradually softened, chandeliers lowering to a gentle amber glow. Conversations faded naturally as the commanding officer returned briefly to the microphone. Tonight, he said evenly, we honor those who built the foundation we stand on. No names were listed. No dramatic pause followed. Just a room filled with Marines standing once again, heads held high. Tom stood among them, not at the front, not singled out, but shoulder to shoulder. Lieutenant Morgan stood directly beside him this time, posture steady, gaze forward. In the softened light, the photograph on the wall seemed almost alive, its figures echoing the silhouettes now standing beneath it. For a brief moment, time felt layered rather than divided. The core of decades past and the core of tonight existed together in that stillness. When the lights slowly brightened again, the music resumed gently. Marines began to move once more, but something remained anchored in the room. Morgan glanced at Tom and spoke quietly. Sir, I will remember this. Tom nodded once. That is all I hoped for. And as the celebration carried on beneath the steady colors of the American flag, it was clear that the lesson of the evening would not fade with the music. It would walk back onto base with every Marine who had stood when it mattered. The lights returned to full brightness, and the ballroom slowly found its rhythm again. But something deeper now ran beneath the laughter and music. Marines moved with a new awareness, conversations carrying more weight, glances lingering a second longer when they passed Thomas Whitaker at the center of the room. He stood quietly near the table where he had cut the cake, hands resting lightly at his sides, observing without drawing attention to himself. Master Sergeant Ryan Cole stepped beside him once more. "Sir," Cole said, his tone steady but reflective, "I have waited a long time to say this properly." Tom turned slightly, the lines around his eyes softening. "You already have," he replied. Cole shook his head gently. "Not fully." He straightened his posture, not as a formal gesture, but as something personal. "You told us that night that we would see our families again. I held on to that sentence for 48 years. Tom looked down briefly, absorbing the weight of memory. "I was hoping you would," he said quietly. Across the ballroom, Lieutenant Kyle Morgan watched the exchange. He no longer stood apart. He had positioned himself within the circle of older Marines, listening, learning. He approached slowly, careful not to interrupt. "Sir," Morgan said, addressing Tom, "may I ask you one more question?" Tom nodded. "Go ahead, Lieutenant." Morgan drew a measured breath. "If you had to leave us with one lesson tonight, what would it be?" The question carried sincerity now, not curiosity. Tom considered the room before answering. He saw polished shoes aligned beneath white tablecloths, saw young faces lit by chandelier glow, saw the American flag standing firm above them all. "Take care of the Marine next to you," he said finally. "Not because it is written somewhere, not because it is expected, but because one day you may be the reason he makes it home." The words settled across the hall with quiet permanence. Lance Corporal Aidan Brooks felt them like an anchor. Several Marines at nearby tables nodded almost imperceptibly, the truth of it undeniable. The orchestra shifted into a slower melody, couples stepping onto the dance floor in careful, respectful movements. The celebration resumed its warmth, yet the lesson remained intact, woven into the evening like thread through fabric. Cole extended his hand once more, not as a subordinate, but as a man greeting the one who had once stood beside him in uncertainty. Tom accepted the handshake firmly. There was no dramatic embrace, no spectacle, just understanding. Lieutenant Morgan stepped forward and offered his hand as well. "Thank you, sir," he said, voice steady. Tom met his gaze. "Lead well," he replied. As the music carried through the ballroom and Marines moved in measured rhythm across the polished floor, the photograph on the wall remained illuminated under steady light. 6 young faces from another time seemed to stand watch over the present. And beneath the steady colors of the flag, in a room filled with disciplined laughter and quiet pride, a simple truth endured. Respect does not demand to be heard. It rises when it is recognized. The evening moved toward its final hour with a steady, grounded calm. The orchestra played a measured arrangement that filled the ballroom without overpowering it, and the polished marble floor reflected the slow rhythm of black shoes and careful steps. Thomas Whitaker stood near the edge of the room now, no longer at the center of attention, but not alone either. Marines continued to approach him in 2s and 3s, offering quiet words, brief handshakes, and firm nods. There were no cameras raised, no speeches requested, just respect given freely. Master Sergeant Ryan Cole remained close, though not hovering. He understood instinctively when to step back and when to stand beside him. Lieutenant Kyle Morgan approached once more, holding a small wooden box in both hands. The box was simple, dark oak, polished but unadorned. "Sir," Morgan said carefully, "the commanding officer asked me to present this to you." Tom looked at the box, then at the young officer. "That is not necessary," he said gently. Morgan shook his head slightly. "It is not a decoration. It is a symbol." He opened the lid. Inside rested a newly minted challenge coin bearing the current insignia of the battalion, the metal bright and untouched. Engraved. Along the edge were 6 small marks. Tom's breath caught for the briefest second. Cole spoke quietly. "We added those this year." Tom lifted the coin slowly, feeling its sharper edges compared to the worn one in his pocket. "You did not have to," he said. "We did," Cole answered. Around them, The music softened further as the final dance of the evening was announced. Couples moved toward the center of the floor in measured steps. The lights dimmed slightly, casting the ballroom in a warm glow. Tom closed the wooden box and handed it back to Morgan. "Keep it," he said. Morgan looked surprised. "Sir." Tom gave a small, steady smile. "Give it to the next lieutenant who thinks belonging is only written on paper." The lesson landed fully this time. Morgan straightened, holding the box with renewed understanding. "Yes, sir." The final notes of the orchestra swelled gently, and the dance floor filled beneath the steady colors of the American flag. Laughter rose again, but it carried something steadier beneath it. Lance Corporal Aidan Brooks stood near the history display once more, looking at the photograph of Echo Company. He imagined the 6 young Marines stepping out of the frame and into the present room, standing shoulder to shoulder with those who now carried the standard forward. Tom adjusted his jacket and prepared to leave quietly, intending to slip out without drawing attention. But as he took his first step toward the exit, chairs shifted again. Not abruptly, not dramatically. Marines rose along the path he walked, table by table, until a corridor formed without a single command spoken. Boots aligned, spines straightened, eyes forward. It was not spectacle. It was acknowledgement. Tom paused at the doorway and turned once more toward the room. He did not salute. He simply placed his hand over his heart in quiet gratitude. Master Sergeant Cole returned the gesture with a crisp salute, joined instantly by every Marine standing within sight. The doors closed softly behind him, and the ballroom remained upright for a long moment longer. Because sometimes honor is not announced. It is recognized. And once recognized, it stands. The ballroom doors closed with a muted click, and the sound lingered in the hallway long after Thomas Whitaker had stepped into the cool night air. Inside, the Marines remained standing for several seconds more, as if the space he left behind still carried weight. Master Sergeant Ryan Cole was the first to lower his salute, his arm steady as it returned to his side. Around him, hands followed in quiet sequence. No one spoke immediately. The orchestra had stopped mid-measure, bows suspended, waiting for the room to settle. Lieutenant Kyle Morgan stood near the center aisle, the small wooden box still resting firmly in his hands. He stared at the closed doors for a long moment before turning back toward the ballroom. Something in his posture had shifted permanently. The sharp edges of assumption had been replaced with steadiness. "Marines," Cole said evenly, his voice carrying without strain, "take your seats." The command was gentle, not corrective. Chairs moved in disciplined rhythm. The room gradually resumed its motion, but the energy was different now, grounded and reflective. Lance Corporal Aidan Brooks remained near the history display, eyes still fixed on the black and white photograph. He stepped closer, studying the 6 young faces captured decades earlier. He imagined the path that had led from that moment in time to tonight's quiet recognition. "They never told the full story," Brooks said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. Morgan approached, hearing him. "Some stories are not written down," Morgan replied. "They are carried." Brooks nodded slowly. "Then we carry it forward." Across the room, Marines returned to their conversations, but the tone had changed. Laughter remained, yet it was tempered with awareness. A few younger officers exchanged thoughtful glances. Senior non-commissioned officers leaned closer to their Marines, sharing small pieces of personal history that had not been spoken before. The commanding officer stepped away from the stage and approached Cole directly. He did not want attention, the commanding officer said quietly. Cole gave a faint smile. He never did. The commanding officer glanced toward the doors. But sometimes attention is not about the person. It is about the example. Cole nodded in agreement. Morgan finally opened the wooden box again, staring at the untouched coin resting inside. The sharp edges gleamed beneath the chandelier light. He traced the 6 engraved marks with his thumb, feeling their deliberate placement. "Master Sergeant," he said, holding the box slightly forward. "I will keep this until it needs to be given." Cole looked at him steadily. "That is how it works." The orchestra resumed softly, but the music felt like background now rather than focus. The real shift had already happened. Near the wall, the framed photograph remained illuminated, the brass plate reflecting steady light. Brooks reached up and adjusted the frame slightly, so it sat perfectly level. It was a small gesture, but deliberate. As the night continued and Marines prepared to return to base, The lesson of the evening did not fade with the final note of music. It settled into memory, into posture, into leadership decisions yet to be made. Outside, beneath the quiet American sky, Thomas Whitaker walked toward the parking lot without looking back. He did not need to. Inside the ballroom, something had already changed, and it would stand long after the lights were turned off. The ballroom slowly emptied as the night drew to a close, polished shoes crossing marble in steady rhythm as Marines made their way toward the exits in disciplined lines. Outside, the air had cooled, carrying the faint scent of the nearby harbor and the distant hum of city traffic. Inside, the staff began clearing tables with quiet efficiency, folding white linens and collecting glassware, yet the history display along the wall remained undisturbed. The black and white photograph of Echo Company still hung beneath steady light, its brass plate gleaming as if newly polished. Lieutenant Kyle Morgan lingered near the center of the room long after most had departed. The wooden box rested in his hand, heavier now not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. Master Sergeant Ryan Cole approached, removing his dress cover and tucking it beneath his arm. "You stayed," Cole observed calmly. Morgan nodded. "I did not want the night to end without understanding it." Cole allowed himself a faint smile. "It does not end here." Morgan looked toward the doors through which Thomas Whitaker had quietly departed. "He walked out the same way he walked in," Morgan said thoughtfully. "Without expectation." Cole folded his arms. "That is why it mattered." Across the room, Lance Corporal Aidan Brooks finished adjusting the history display, ensuring the frame sat perfectly straight. He stepped back to examine it one final time before turning toward the two senior Marines. "Sir," Brooks said respectfully, "I requested permission to update the unit history summary. I think his name should be included." Cole studied the young Marine for a moment before nodding. "Submit the request through proper channels," he replied. "But remember what he said. It was never about being mentioned." Brooks nodded slowly. "Then we will mention the lesson." Morgan opened the wooden box once more and lifted the newly minted coin into the light. The sharp edges caught the chandelier glow, casting small reflections across the polished floor. "I will not forget," Morgan said quietly. Cole stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "Forgetting is easy. Living it is harder." The words settled deeply. Outside, the last few Marines stepped into the parking lot, their laughter fading as engines started and headlights cut through the dark. The American flag inside the ballroom remained motionless, its colors steady beneath dimming lights. Morgan walked toward the history display and stood beside Brooks. He studied the 6 young faces in the photograph once more, imagining the distance of decades between then and now. "They stood together," Morgan said. Brooks nodded. "And tonight, so did we." Cole joined them briefly, looking at the frame without speaking. The silence was not empty. It was complete. After a moment, he turned toward the exit. "Secure the room," he instructed evenly. As the final lights dimmed and the doors were locked, the ballroom fell quiet. But the lesson carried beyond its walls. In offices, in barracks, in early morning formations yet to come, the memory of that evening would remain. Not because a speech had been delivered, not because a medal had been displayed, but because a room full of Marines had recognized something timeless and chosen to rise. And long after the music faded and the tables were cleared, that choice would continue to stand. Morning came early over the base, pale light stretching across concrete and steel as reveille echoed faintly through the cool air. Marines moved toward formation in clean lines, boots striking pavement in steady rhythm, the routine as precise as ever. Yet beneath the discipline, something from the night before remained. It was visible in the way shoulders squared a little straighter, in the way younger Marines glanced briefly at the man beside them before facing forward. Lieutenant Kyle Morgan stood at the front of his platoon, the small wooden box secured inside his desk back in his office. He had arrived 30 minutes earlier than usual, not out of obligation, but reflection. Master Sergeant Ryan Cole took his position nearby, arms folded behind his back, eyes scanning the formation with practiced calm. "Platoon, attention," Morgan called, his voice firm but measured. The movement snapped into place. Silence followed. He studied the rows before him, recognizing now that leadership was not measured only by command presence, but by awareness. "Yesterday," Morgan began, choosing his words carefully, We were reminded that belonging is not always visible. The Marines remained motionless, but their focus sharpened. Lance Corporal Aidan Brooks stood in the second row, chin lifted, remembering the bronze coin and the photograph on the wall. Morgan continued, "We wear the uniform with pride, but the standard we represent was carried long before us." His gaze drifted briefly toward the battalion headquarters building behind them, where the history display now held more meaning than ever. "Take care of the Marine next to you," Morgan said steadily. "Because one day, you may be the reason he stands." The words were simple, but they carried weight earned only hours earlier. Cole gave a subtle nod of approval. Formation dismissed, the Marines broke into their morning routine, heading toward training fields and maintenance bays. Brooks paused briefly at the headquarters entrance before stepping inside. The hallway was quiet, sunlight filtering through high windows and casting narrow beams across the polished floor. He stopped in front of the black and white photograph once more. It hung perfectly level, brass plate shining softly. Beneath the unit name, a small new line had been added in modest lettering, "Lesson endures." Brooks smiled faintly. Outside, Morgan retrieved the wooden box from his desk and opened it one more time. The coin rested inside, sharp edges catching the morning light. He closed the lid carefully and placed it back in the drawer. Not as a keepsake, as a reminder. Across town, Thomas Whitaker sat on the porch of his modest home, a cup of coffee warming his hands as the sun rose higher. He did not know what changes had begun at the base that morning. He did not need to. The bronze coin he carried rested in his jacket pocket, worn edges smooth from decades of quiet memory. He watched the light stretch across the neighborhood and allowed himself a small, satisfied breath. Somewhere behind him, a flag stirred gently in the breeze. And miles away, on a base awakening to routine, Marines stepped into their day with something steadier beneath their boots. Some lessons are spoken, others are simply lived. And when the moment calls for it, those who understand do not hesitate. They rise.